Good evening, and welcome back to Breathingspace, the quietest corner of the internet. I'm Sam. Hit the follow button now for access to more bedtime stories, meditation and affirmation episodes, and a better night's sleep. Tonight, lie back and listen in to a relaxing story rich in Arthurian legend. This is the story of the Lady of the Lake and a young Sir Lancelot. Before we tuck into tonight's tale, why not take a moment to wind down from the day? When you're ready, get settled in a comfortable position and allow your eyes to gently drift closed. Draw a deep breath in through your nose and exhale out through your mouth. As you come to settle, grant yourself a moment to breathe in the perfect peace of the evening and breathe out the rush of the day. Breathing in, welcome the perfect peace of the night sky into your body and let the wash of your out-breath carry all the stress and negativity out of your muscles. Let your breath drift deeper now and feel yourself sinking deeper and deeper into a state of relaxation. Inhale and feel your breath deepening once more, sinking down to settle at the core of your being and opening out your lungs as they too fill with the soothing evening air. As you exhale, let your abdomen soften and release your chest. Breathing in once more, perhaps you notice that there's a little more space within you now. There is room within for you to relax, to breathe into, to think and feel from without the pressures that bind you in the daylight hours to demand your attention and distract you. This space is yours and yours alone. Rest easy and allow yourself to settle into a state of deep relaxation tonight, safe in the knowledge that that sacred space is always within you and only ever a few deep breaths away. Now, if you're feeling ready, tonight's tale can begin. Vivian had been called a lot of things over the years. The Lady of the Lake, Nimue, even Ninian or Ninien for a while, which she hadn't liked too much. They had called her Nimench, Nivian, Niviana, Niman and Ninian. More recently though, from her home on the borders of Avalon, she had heard the name Nimue carrying across the plains in the breeze. It had been whispered by scholars living either side of the boundary separating those who slept and woke and worked and said the Lord's Prayer before bed, and those who slept less and woke only to wish, to cast their magic out all day long and sing their incantations to the moon and stars. She rather hoped Nimue would stick, for she had accepted long ago that her true name, Vivian, was already lost to time, and hoped at least that when the people of Avalon finally began to take seriously the recording of information, events, names and dates, it would be the name Nimue they inked into eternity upon the parchment, for she thought it rang rather nicely at the ears. Centuries after Vivian's story was concluded, a book of Anglo-English folklore named Le Morte d'Arthur was first scribbled out onto parchment and bound to the spine of a book. Much to her relief, the name Nimue was indeed the name used. Though Le Morte d'Arthur was not the only recount of the infamous Lady of the Lake's story, it is perhaps the earliest and most widely recognized. Some say that as time went by, the tales of her became fantastical and painted her with a power and greed she simply did not possess. But that has always been the case with stories passed from person to person and only written down thereafter. Those, and indeed these, stories are of course to be taken with a pinch of salt, but I'd wager that all the best tales ought to be. For decades Vivian lived alone, the quiet of her solitude made even quieter by the water that washed through her palace beneath the lake. The waters of the lake were generally still enough to reflect the stars in the night sky, and one might easily have mistaken it for a puddle of the cosmos that had dripped down from the heavens to pool on the outskirts of Avalon. She couldn't hear the tap of her feet against the stone steps beneath them. The water stifled sounds like that. When she cooked, the clatter of pans and spattering of oil never crowded her. Beneath the surface of the lake, there was only the sound of her thoughts and the gentle wash of the water to greet her each morning as she awoke. For a long time, that was exactly how Vivian liked it. In the early days, when the borders were not settled and the men still banded together to fight over them, there were far more footprints in the mud surrounding the lake she called home. But for all the fighting, it was time that had settled most of the disputes. With many having lost so much to the conflict, they could hardly find it in themselves to care about defining borders and staking a claim to patches of land too sodden with lake water to plant crops anyway. The quarrelling finally stopped, and so too in large part did the animosity. Those that lived beyond the veil of magic in Avalon, where the Lady of the Lake made her home, tended not to interfere with the dealings of those that lived in the human realm, and the humans beyond the border had ceased to fear or dread encounters with their magical counterparts. Before the fighting had drawn to a close, Vivian had done the great King Arthur of Camelot an even greater favour. After the sword he pulled from the stone shattered in battle, his magical advisor Merlin took him to see Vivian where she resided in the lake. Merlin encouraged Arthur to throw the fragments of his sword into the lake, and putting his trust in the wizard, he did just that. Merlin drew back to the battlefield, but Arthur waited, as instructed, with nothing but the stillness of the lake and his empty hands to keep him company. It seemed an eternity had passed when Arthur first noticed a rippling on the surface of the water, a rumbling from its depths. Steadfast and brave, he stood resolute in the face of a magic he would never quite be able to understand. When Vivian's head first crested the surface of the water, it was her red hair that caught Arthur's attention first. It gave way to the alabaster plains of her face, and eyes as blue as the waters from which she had emerged. She continued to rise without the tide, and as her form was revealed, he saw the sword balanced upon her open palms. She carried it towards him, bringing it just near enough that he could recognize the hilt he had thrown into the water and the inscription upon the blade that had once been buried deep in a stone that only he had been able to pull it from. "It is Arthur, is it not?" Vivian asked, and he dared not ask her to address him as king, for it was clear to see that Vivian was a law unto her own. Arthur nodded, words deserting him as she came closer still. This sword goes by a different name now. I call it Excalibur, and you would be wise to as well, she asserted. Excalibur it is, the king nodded, noticing the glow that radiated from the sword as he spoke its name and called to it. I bound it with my magic, and so you might find it capable of a little more than the one you pulled from the stone, Vivian smiled. Arthur nodded in thanks and almost expected the conditions the Lady of the Lake laid out for him before she handed him the sword. I grant you this sword on the condition that you fight only for peace, for freedom of religion in Avalon and Camelot alike, so that one day there can be peace betwixt the two realms. I grant it to you on the condition that should you hear my call, you heed it. What say you, Arthur? It is widely known that Arthur agreed to Vivian's terms, but that afternoon, as he wandered away from the lake and rather reluctantly back to the battlefield, Arthur himself hardly knew what he had agreed to, just that he and the Lady of the Lake shared a common goal in establishing peace between the two realms. Perhaps the Lady of the Lake did possess a power that made most uncomfortable, but Arthur could sense that her heart was good, even if time had twisted it up a little over the centuries. When a young Sir Lancelot, out exploring beyond the bounds of where he had been born, lingered by the lakeside, he thought perhaps to stay the night. Lancelot too had found himself alone in the world at a young age, and so when Vivian first rose from the center of the lake and began a slow swim toward him, he wasn't afraid. Like a fawn before its first winter, Lancelot didn't yet know the evils of the earth well enough to run from them. He had spent so much of his short life wanting for people, for a family, for friends to call his own, that he had yet to realize that some people are simply not worth sharing your life with. As Vivian made her approach, she found herself rather moved that the boy didn't recoil. Even at only 8 years old, he didn't shuffle backwards up the beach or look as uncomfortable as even the knights who had come specifically to seek an audience with her tended to. Here was Lancelot, still young enough to be without prejudice, without judgment of the woman who chose to live alone beneath the waters of the lake. He didn't know Vivian was the woman who had given Excalibur willingly to ensure the right side won, or that she had made it her business to trap the wizard Merlin in a tree for 1,000 years for expecting her love in return for lessons. Lancelot had found himself alone in life, and even after the world had treated him with such cruelty and forced him into such solitude, his heart had remained good. Vivian recognized much of herself in him, and for that reason took the boy in without thought. She taught him honor and bravery and gentleness. She taught him his sums and how to take clippings from the flowers around the lake so that they could grow more together. When he was old enough, with a heavy heart, she sent him out into the world once more. Lancelot was bound for the kingdom of Lagresse and became known as the White Knight for his platinum blonde hair. Though he missed the home Vivian had built for them, he knew she was never far out of reach. Upon his index finger he wore a ring she had bestowed upon him and insisted he wear every day since. The ring protected him from enchantments that anyone tried to place upon him. Even when years had passed and Lancelot had grown his own family, Vivian still looked out for him in her own way. There was a kindness about Vivian, an evenness to the way she chose to conduct herself, and even if in the tales that carried across the plains they called her cold and wicked and hard-hearted, she knew it not to be the truth, and in raising him she had proved it to Lancelot. Vivian had been born more beautiful than most, and not long after she sent Lancelot away to live the life she had prepared him for, the wizard Merlin came calling once more. Vivian was strong, but she was a good deal younger than Merlin, and much suspected that there was a great deal of knowledge she could learn from the ancient wizard. It seemed vital to her to study the ways of the old world before they were lost to time entirely. Merlin had been in love with Vivian for decades by the time their paths crossed for a second time. In truth, he had fallen far and fast for her, ever since that fateful day at the lake with Arthur, where he had hidden between the trees and watched her emerge with the enchanted Excalibur. Merlin had thought of her and visited her in his dreams, night after night, until he could no longer bear the distance between them and sought her out once more. When she rose to meet him at the edge of the lake and he stepped into the water, a prophecy shook him to his very core, a premonition of sorts. Merlin knew that the Lady of the Lake would trap him, that Vivian would be his end, and yet he had fallen so in love with her that when she asked him to teach her all that he knew, the wizard did as she wished, and knowingly sealed his own fate. Day by day, the pair stooped over the inky pages of old grimoires, and night after night Merlin gifted Vivian freely all of the spells and rituals that would one day serve as her weapons against him. When there was no longer anything she could learn from the old wizard, whom she had promised her heart so long as he taught her everything he knew, Vivian sealed his soul in the trunk of a great old tree, suspending him in an eternal, deep and peaceful slumber. Perhaps what Vivian did was unfair. Perhaps it was wrong of her, for she later took the old wizard's role as Arthur's magical advisor. But some say that perhaps Merlin welcomed his fate. One has to wonder if maybe the wizard had been ready to rest in the trunk of that great tree after so long walking the earth. Perhaps Merlin was due a long and restful sleep, and perhaps you are too.